Ahi ahi Maria e te iwi, ko Shannon toko ingoa kei aratahi taku mahi. Welcome back to our Involve webinar series. Really excited to have you here and super excited to jump in. Please do, it's so cool that there are two Mirandas hanging out. Please do intro yourself into the chat as you're done. And also, if you have any questions and that you'd like answered during the session, Miranda Warner has graciously invited you to note those questions in, and Miranda will answer those during the course of our webinar today. But first off, I'm going to just open with a karakia, and you can join me if you know this one. Ka inoi tātou, ko ranganui kei urunga, ko papatuanuku kei raro, ko ngā tangata kei waina nui, tihei mauri ora. Awesome. So we're going to jump straight in, and this is my opportunity to invite you, the wonderful Miranda Warner, in Takaka, I believe, at the moment, to turn on your video and unmute yourself and share this amazing mahi that you're doing with drama, and also the work that you're doing in schools. So pop on here. Thank you so very much. And I say, please do take it away.
Kia ora. Welcome everyone. Do feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and flick any questions my way during the course of the thing. I'm happy to be interrupted and to clarify anything. So yeah, feel free. So just to kind of introduce myself a wee bit. I grew up in the UK, but I moved to New Zealand in 2009. So I'm a Kiwi by immigration. And my background in work is with kids and young people. So I ran an after-school program for almost 8 years in Nelson with tamariki, especially welcoming those with challenging behaviour. And that was largely run by a volunteer team of youth. We did have some adults who mucked in as well, but so I was running a youth group, and a lot of the rangatahi from that group joined me in leading the program. And then we sort of just worked alongside families who were struggling or needed additional support. And then in 2018, I went back to the UK for a year to do a master's in applied theatre. And during that year, I specifically focused on the use of drama and theatre in the criminal justice system. But since coming back to New Zealand, I've been kind of looking at different ways to apply what I've learned. And currently, I am working in primary schools in Tasman. And I'm associated with a group of counsellors. They're going into schools and offering one-on-one counselling to primary school kids. And I am running groups for between sort of 2 and 6 kids at a time, where we use sort of drama and games to look at things like friendship, how we kind of acknowledge and express without hurting ourselves and others, things like anger and anxiety, and just sort of general emotional literacy. So I'm gonna, when I sort of talk about this work and the kind of different things I've done with it, I will reference some work with teenagers, but I think that the beauty of this work is that it's not really age specific. So I hope that you'll find that it's pretty applicable, whether this is work that I've done with adults or kids or teenagers. I will reference some of the work I've done in South Africa as well. So I piloted a lot of this work during my degree in Cape Town. I ran a 5-week program in the maximum security prison in Cape Town for a restorative justice organization, and I was working with men who were pre-release. So some had been in for a long time, some for a short time, but what they had in common was that they were awaiting release. And with them, we looked at sort of building emotional literacy or expanding emotional literacy. We looked at anger, at empathy, at forgiveness, and then at sort of facing obstacles on release. I also worked with a group of teenagers who were in a community home, who'd come from quite significant backgrounds of trauma. And and together we looked at things like themes of we did some emotional literacy work, and then we looked at anger and fear and anxiety and feelings of worthlessness as well. And then finally, with a group of kids, I was working in a township where there's a considerable amount of gang violence and gun crime. All the kids I worked with had seen people shot dead and had a lot to say that they wanted to communicate about their local community to the adults in it. So together we created a play that sort of allowed them in fictional form to share their thoughts and insights into what living in that community was like for them, and to present that to the adults. So that's just a bit of a background. I hope that's helpful into some of the work that I've done in this field of using drama, not simply for putting on shows, which I happen to love. I do write plays and put them on, and that's great. But I'm particularly passionate about using drama to explore emotions, to explore empathy, to explore communicating and amplifying voices that don't always get heard. And I think probably just on the teenager front, given that this is specifically rangatahi focused, I think it's really important to note that I've found in the work I've done in this area with teenagers that if it is forced or mandatory, it loses almost all of its value. I've tried to do some of this sort of work in school settings, and I've found that I guess you can never fully judge these things, but I've found that the kind of value that it has, I think, is quite diminished, because it's really important, I think, for young people particularly, if they're exploring emotional literacy, even if they're experimenting with acting, there's an inherent vulnerability in all of that. There's an inherent exposure, even though I like to do it with a lot of play and games and fun and laughter. There is nonetheless a sense of personal exposure and risk. And so when that's done in a setting that is kind of educational and mandatory, it can be quite tricky. So my caution would be that this sort of work does work really well with young people, but it needs to be that young people have chosen to engage with this work and are not just sort of consenting to it, but are enthusiastically wanting to engage. And I think with teenagers, some of the best uses for this kind of drama work involve decision-making, using drama to help with making big decisions, so that you can sort of explore and inhabit different potential responses to a decision, and kind of play out how those might work out. And equally, I think it can be really effective for in essence, rehearsing for the real world. So there might be things that that rangatahi you work with haven't done before, whether that's applying for a job or an interview setting or something like that. And I think through using drama, you can approach those things with a lot of play, a lot of fun, a lot of lightness. But in so doing, you actually get a chance to practice and then have an embodied and lived experience of having been in that setting, having survived that setting for starters, but also maybe having even excelled in that setting before you go into it in real life. And that can be a real confidence builder, I think. And it can also just take some of the edge off it. If you've sort of played with something, it often has less of a sort of fearful hold over us. I think this work is also, as I've mentioned, really valuable in increasing our emotional literacy and in experimenting with how we might regulate our emotions, how we might, as I say to kids, how we can look after ourselves and other people when we have big emotions. So how do we acknowledge them? How do we express them? And how do we do that in a way that isn't damaging? And I think this drama approach has a lot to offer in that. And then finally, I think it can be really helpful in building empathy. I think this is particularly valuable in youth justice settings, but of course in any sort of conflict or just lack of understanding between groups. Drama is as close as you can get to putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. You can literally put yourself in somebody else's costume, use their words, and explore explore almost from the inside what it might be like to be that person, to be in that situation, what sort of feelings might come up. And in my experience of working with men in prison, I found that to be exceptionally powerful. Yeah, so what I would like to do is to offer you a few stories of some of the things that I've done that I've felt have been really valuable and had a positive impact, and then share those some of those activities you can use with you. So my hope is that you leave with not only an idea of how this kind of work can function, but some tools to test it and play with it yourself. This is definitely something that, you know, when you have the tools, you can just give it a go. If, you know, particularly if you already have established a group culture where there's a lot of trust and a willingness to try new things. I hope you can take and run with these tools and just see how they fit for your setting. So I think I find it really helpful, sort of no matter what I'm approaching, whether it's looking more at gaining skills or empathy or looking at obstacles or making decisions. It's really helpful to have just a real build up to the drama work. For some people, drama is a scary word. Some people obviously have bad recollections of drama experiences at school. And so I tend to start any group with a lot of games, just to sort of warm people up and set a real precedent for fun and for play. And then I kind of gently introduce drama using theatre sports or improv activities. So the key thing to really know about improv which is improvisation, which I think will help with all of these sorts of drama activities, is the principle of yes and. So what that means is that if you are creating a scene together, one person comes on and will say something, anything, there's a dragon over there. And the other person doesn't respond with, no, there isn't, because what that does is just stop the drama before it's even begun. And it will end up with probably an argument that's actually not very interesting to watch or engage with. So the idea is that the other person responds to what's been offered with yes and. They don't necessarily need to use the words yes and, but they might say something like, oh my word, and it's getting closer, or yes, and it's wearing a pink tutu. And then you each build on what the other is saying and create this kind of shared world and silliness together. So I tend to play quite a lot of games involving those sorts of principles, which don't have to be deep and meaningful at all. There is a really fun one called the question game, where the group sets a scene. So let's say a submarine, and two people come on and they're on a submarine and they have to talk to each other only in questions. And the moment one of them responds with a statement instead of a question, they leave and a new person comes up to join and you get a new setting. So on board a submarine, it might be something like, is that a leak I see over there? Did you say a leak? We are underwater, aren't we? Did you think we're on the land? You know, so on. So you're sort of just playing backwards and forwards, and the minute one of you doesn't say a question, you leave. I think it's really helpful to emphasize that in improvisation, the comedy is all in the mistakes. And I think that's also just really helpful for life. That if you, in doing this work, are kind of setting a culture where failure is actually even celebrated, then it makes later on doing those more vulnerable activities seem less threatening. So those sorts of activities can easily be sort of leveled up to the next level with there are some great improvisation activities around emotions that I found really helpful to work with the group together to kind of create our own list of emotions. So we'll often brainstorm as many emotions as we can think of, and then we'll start playing with them. One really fun game to play is you have two people on stage, which just means in front of the group. And one of them will come up with a really boring phrase. So I've dropped my pencil, I just put the washing on, something like that. And the other person has to have thought of an emotion that they're going to come on with. And they then need to respond to that boring phrase with the emotion. So person A will say, I just dropped my pencil. And if person B has chosen anger, they're going to come on and be like, I can't believe you dropped your pencil. Why are you always dropping things? You're so clumsy. And then the next person has to, the previous person has to respond. Oh, I didn't know I had frustrated you so much. Yes, you're always blah, blah, blah. And then we get the scene doesn't need to go for very long. You could just do 30 seconds so that it doesn't feel like an intimidating thing for people to do. If they're really into the drama, you can let it go on. But then I tend to get the group to guess what the emotion was. And as we field guesses, we're filling our piece of paper with more and more different emotions and drawing out the nuance between them. So saying, okay, so that was anger, but earlier we had frustration. What's the difference between them? And rage, what's the difference between those? And so just together with a lot of play and a lot of fun and a lot of hilarity, we're starting to build a wider vocabulary that we can continue to refer back to. So yeah, I'm happy to share lots more activities, and I am in time hoping to get some resources online. So I'm happy to share more that way as well. But I think that's a sort of, I think those are the important basics and sort of structures to put in place before you go too deep. I wouldn't recommend leaping in at the deep end, talking about our own emotional stuff or vulnerability or our own conflicts without having done some of that work first. So I'll give you an example of how you could use these drama tools to brainstorm a situation. So you could use this for figuring out how to maybe act in a different way, how to approach a new situation. There's a really cool, I think, tool called forum theatre, which was started by Augusto Boal in Brazil. And I've used a version of it. It's a simplified version, but I've used it in a number of settings. I'll give you an example from the prison work that I did. We were looking at anger that week, and I asked for the men to give me an example of how anger can turn into violence in prison. And they gave me the example of someone leaving their cigarettes, their smokes as they call them, on their bed in a cell. The person who owns the smokes leaves the cell and somebody else takes them. The owner comes back in, sees the smokes are gone, and beats the guy up. So what we did was, having established some ground rules of we can act out violence, but we never touch each other. And then as soon as you finish the scene, I like to get everyone to just shake, to come out of role and to remember, okay, no, now I'm Miranda. I was, angry man, now I'm Miranda. So we get them to act that scene out. And then I ask everyone who's watching to watch as we go through the scene again, play it out again. And this time, if they think that somebody in the scene could act in a different way that might avert violence, they shout pause. And at that point, we pause the drama, the actors freeze, and then the person suggests what could be done differently. At that point, they become the character who they think, they become the character whose behavior could change. They try out that change. The rest of the those acting respond to that change, and we just see where it goes. And we just try it again and again and again. In this case, we tried lots of different things. We also had a rule that is Boal's rule, that you don't have magical solutions. So you can't have the owner of the cigarettes just coming back into the cell and saying, don't worry, I'm happy to share, because that's not what's going to happen in prison. So we're not going to entertain ideas that are unrealistic. At the same point, we try not to work with a precise scenario that has happened with the same names and people. We want to keep it in the hypothetical, to in the imaginary, to avoid kind of crossing the line between the imagined and the real, but relevant enough to their setting that this is directly applicable. So we actually, I think, went through this scene 10 times with no avoidance of the violence. And one of the difficult things about being a facilitator with this kind of work is that you don't actually know what the answer is. So it's very much a case of trusting the process. I don't know what's going to reduce violence in prison. I personally haven't spent time in a South African prison, so what do I know? But eventually, through going over it again and again and again, we did have someone who paused the scene and said, I'd like to become one of the bystanders, one of the other people in the cell. And they approached the person who'd stolen the cigarettes whilst the owner of the cigarettes was out of the room, told him to put them back. And when the owner of the cigarettes came back, the cigarettes were still on his bed. So there was no violence. And so what I had expected was going to be some kind of learning about how we contain our own emotions for ourselves and then find safe places to express them, in the end actually turned out, which I recognize as a very pakiha, a very kind of white Western approach to the world. Instead, I was really schooled when I realized through them that the answer was actually about everybody taking responsibility for the potential for things to escalate to violence, and instead interacting where they could to minimize that risk for others. So that was really fantastic. And we also tried a few scenarios for when they left, like if they have an antagonistic boss at work when they're on the outside, how would they manage that? And we did have one guy later in the week. There was later in the program, there was a fight broke out where he was attacked over breakfast. And he later told me that he was able not to retaliate and therefore lengthen his sentence because of this kind of rehearsing that we'd been doing for those kind of situations. So that was really exciting. So that could be used in all sorts of different settings. Again, that could be used for a job interview, for example, for young people. It doesn't have to be a kind of emotional regulation setting. And I think if you are working with a scenario like a job interview where people are feeling quite stressed about it, it's really helpful to ask young people to do it as badly as possible the first time, and spend a bit of time exploring how badly you could do it and really enjoying that, laughing about how awful you could be, how inappropriate you could be, within bounds, obviously. And then it's very easy to do a little bit better than that. So the pressure's off having to get it perfect. And it's a bit less high stakes. And I think what that also does is it removes the kind of sense of fear of the whole situation. I'm just going to take a question now. So the question is, can you share stories when participants may not have had a wide emotional vocabulary and comprehension? How do you work through this? Cool. Yes. So when I'm working with kids in this cultural setting, a lot of them have seen Inside Out. So you can start with 5 basic emotions. But really in any group, short of a significant language barrier, you should have maybe 5 that people can come up with, I would think. And I think one of the things alongside the improvisation activities that I do is kind of explore those emotions and the difference between them. So I could say, okay, let's see, what does it look like when people are angry? And so people will act with their faces, with their bodies, what anger is like. And we can also, and then I might ask people, okay, so what does that feel like on the inside when you're acting that? Because really, if people are engaging in the acting of it, the kind of beauty of it is that you do engage with feeling that as well at the same time. So we can then start to explore, okay, so when you're acting angry, you also feel a bit tight in your stomach, or your face tenses up, or those sorts of things. And then I might offer another emotion that's similar. So say like frustration. I say, can you show me what frustrated is? What does that look like? I wonder how that's different. And we just start to discuss and sort of wonder. And I think in a group setting, there may be a limited emotional vocabulary, but normally there'll be a few different people will have different words. And I think that's helpful. So you can sort of wonder out loud and get people to input. But I think, yeah, it helps to start with the emotions that you've got and then think of associated emotions that might, that are similar but different, and then start parsing out those differences. Another way you could do it is you could just play with the improvisation games that I said earlier. So like, you know, you're on a submarine doing this and that. Play with those sorts of scenes, and then ask, okay, so what sort of emotions do you think the characters had? What were they feeling? Maybe don't even use the word emotion. What sort of feelings were they having? What does that look like? Or even you get really obscure, and this is quite fun. I sometimes get young people into groups of 3 or 4 and say, okay, create a sculpture or create a machine with your bodies that represents, say, sadness, or a machine that would produce sadness, or so just kind of creatively working your way and playfully working your way around those things. And every time a new one comes up, I just write it up so we can just see that our group of words is our vocabulary list is growing, basically. Just responding to another question. So it looks like you need to be quite creative and adaptable to run these sessions. How do you prepare well, especially to anticipate what would come out and how to keep everyone safe? Okay, great question. I think around the safety thing first, the term we use in applied theatre is scaffolding. So when I was talking about starting with those really playful activities that aren't too intense and working gradually up, I think that's really important in terms of safety, because not only does it not put people on the spot in a way that is really confronting, but additionally, what it's doing is working on building that culture of play and trust. And as you do that, it kind of creates a foundation where from which the rest of the work on which it can build. Another thing I tend to do is in these activities, the sort of higher level activities, they can get quite intense. So as I said, one of the things I think is really important is to de-roll, is to just sort of shake it off. And then that's physically shake it off, but then also I will normally bring it straight down by playing another game that has no particular meaning, but just something that's really playful. And as I work with groups, we establish what the favorite games are. And after something intense, we'll come back down immediately by just playing a really fun game. And I think as well, in terms of the way that our brains work, we don't actually function particularly well learning at high intensity for long periods of time. But if we have these bursts of intensity and learning and then come down and sort of play and make sure that we are kind of connected and not in that kind of fight or flight or freeze space, that we're connected, we're playful, we're in a creative space again, then we can reapproach those difficult things. If we stay in that intensity, I think that's when it can become a bit unsafe. So what I tend to do is, in terms of preparation, is to create a plan, but I'll normally have a selection of opening games that I might do, a selection of closing games, and then a few options of where we might go in the session. But I won't be absolutely committed to getting to a certain learning point or to spending X amount of time on the kind of more intense input. I think it's really important to read the room. Something else that I do is always start with a check-in. So I'll ask people, normally people are able to say how they're doing out of 10. And as time goes on in the group, we'll start to use words from our vocabulary, but I check in and see where people are at. And if people are actually feeling quite low or quite stressed or whatever, I will immediately, well, when I'm doing a good job, to be honest, like, but I will try and immediately lower my expectations for what we might achieve in that session, just to make sure that I'm not pushing people beyond where they might be, you know, comfortably able to go in that session. So yeah, I absolutely don't create a rock solid plan that I stick to come what may. I don't think that's helpful. So another really helpful, another thing that I think is, oh, okay, I've just had a question about sharing a non-verbal activity that I've used and really like. Okay, cool. Well, one of the things actually I like to do in empathy building is to use freeze frames. So this is another example from a prison setting. I created some scenarios and said, okay, a family has just been out to the movies. This is a really rare treat for them. It's the youngest kid's birthday. They've come home and they found their house has been broken into. Can you, so who, and then I ask questions, who's in the family, how many people, blah, blah, blah. And then we'll stage, and then I say, can you create a photo? So in drama terms, it's a freeze frame, but a still photo of the moment they walk back into the house. And often a lot of people who are a bit concerned about, improvisation where they have to come up with words on the spot. This is something that is approachable. So they can just create like a statue of, I am the mum, I've just come back, my house has been burgled. What do I look like? And then we can get other people to reflect on what they might be thinking, what they might be feeling. The participant can also speak to that too, but doesn't have to. I think in terms of team building games, there are a lot of really good non-verbal ones. One of my favorite ones is a version of Creep Up Jack that's collaborative. The usual rules of Creep Up Jack, you have one person, normally it's me, who faces the wall, and I have something like a hat behind me. The rest of the group have to sneak up. Every time I turn around, they freeze. If I see any of them moving, I send them back. So I could just point to them, use their name, whatever's culturally appropriate, and send them back, and then they come again. But the idea is they have to steal. I did this in prison and they thought it was very funny. I was teaching them to steal. They have to take the item from my feet, hide it. When I turn around, I shouldn't be able to see it. If I can see it, they need to put it back. And the more of them touch the item before they get it back to where they started, the more points a team has. So that's a game that I use with all ages, actually. And then you can sort of up the ante and have obstacles. I think obstacle courses are brilliant as well. For engagement, they can be entirely non-verbal. And that can also be a really helpful metaphor later on. So some of the work I did in prison as well was around the obstacles people would face on their return to freedom. And so having done some very sort of fun, playful obstacle courses, we then, and at this point we'd built up, this is 5 weeks worth of kind of trust and a sense of community, and people were able to share what they felt the big challenges would be for them on their return. And by that point, people were willing to act out little scenes for them so that they would have to confront that challenge, that obstacle, and succeed in order to move on to the next obstacle, in order to reach a goal. So obstacle courses are super fun. They can be made with bodies or items in the room or obscure rules, but they also can be kind of leveled up to some quite significant work around facing challenges, sort of playfully, but in quite meaningful ways. I think in terms of engaging with shy and self-conscious rangatahi, that's another question. I really stick with group games for quite a long time if I notice that people are really shy and really unwilling, insecure about engaging. Stick with group games that don't involve people being on the spot. And another way you can sort of add another layer of scaffolding after the group games is that you can also split people into pairs, say, and they can work on little scenes together, but without performing them to a group. So I think another step up that's gentle for people is to take the audience idea out of it. And then it becomes like just working on something with a partner. No one's going to see it, but you can, as a group, feedback like, oh, so what did you learn from the conversation, from the little scene you had with your partner? So that's another way of just scaffolding, of gently taking people through that acting thing. Another thing that I've also used, and I found this really helpful with kids and also really helpful in prison. With my prison group, they were so willing and engaged until we started talking about saying sorry, apology, forgiveness, those kind of things. And they absolutely point blank refused to act out anything in which they'd have to apologize. And after a bit of querying from me as a kind of total outsider by gender, by race, by culture, I learned from them, they said, oh, men don't apologize. So I was like, gosh, okay, what do I do here? So the next session, what we did was I brought in paper. There's very little you can bring into prison, but I had learned to make paper puppets, very, very basic, where you just sort of scrunch up paper, scrunch and unfold, scrunch and unfold, scrunch and unfold for ages. And then it turns into a kind of material type substance and create little puppets. And so I asked them to, in pairs, again, without an audience, to work out, to act out a little scenario in which there are two people and they both have a reason to apologize to each other. And could they experiment with seeing what happened if they apologized? This way, it was their puppets that were apologizing to each other, not them. So they were practicing saying the words, but they weren't actually inhabiting, living, being seen as a person who had just apologized in an embodied way. And so that was actually really powerful. And from there, they were willing to actually engage with the acting. But I think using puppets or using just little toys, sculpting stuff, and acting with those is another way to help people who are a bit more shy and self-conscious engage with this kind of work. I think maybe I might just add, I'm just keeping an eye on the time, maybe I might just add a little bit to what I said about those life obstacle courses, because I think that is something that can be really powerful with young people too. So in that prison setting, what I did was ask them if they're willing. Not everybody did this, but what is one thing you are hoping for on your release? What is something you want to aim towards? And it might be like running a restaurant from my house, like a takeout, or it might be being involved in a dance team. There were all sorts. I said, and what can you name 3 obstacles that are going to stand in your way from achieving your goal? And those were all sorts of things, from drug use to the potential to fall back into criminal activity, to like difficult relationships, whatever. And so in that group, they would name those things and they would ask somebody to represent they would pick somebody in the group who was going to represent their goal for them. And then I would divide the rest of the group into 3 and give each of those 3 groups one of the obstacles to work with. This was actually a very, very funny activity, but quite meaningful as well. So, and I learned a lot. So maybe like the temptation of drugs of returning to drugs was one. And so I go to that group, I say, okay, so he's going to come to you and you are going to try and get him to take drugs from you. And he's going to try and work at refusing that. Don't make it too hard, but, he really does have to push to do that. Then he'd move on to the next. And so they would act that out for him. He would go, he would face that obstacle, move on. And then meet the next group who maybe they created some very funny scenes about open windows with TVs inside them and encouraging him to just break into that house, take the TV, come on, it's an easy, you know, few $1,000. And so he went through each of those obstacles and then reached the person who represented his goal, who would then congratulate him, and then we'd all like whoop and cheer. And so again, I think with young people, it's really helpful to kind of, I think it can help with overwhelm if you can say, okay, this is my goal, and rather than everything feels too hard, to name 2 or 3 things that feel difficult, and to just have that experience, even though it's playful and in some ways silly, but that experience of facing that thing that you're afraid of and engaging with it and then moving on, just does, I think, has a genuine power to build confidence, because people are have some kind of embodied lived experience of, I faced that and I got through it, and that can build courage for the next time that you might do it on a bigger scale. Okay, 2 great questions. How do you go about unpacking things that someone might say which are problematic, but they haven't realized it? So offensive, racist, making assumptions. Yeah. Okay. Obviously, this depends very much on the context, but I think it's depending on the context, I would try and identify if there is something that the person's getting at that is positive in that, because I think we want to avoid, really at any cost in our groups, shaming people, because because we want to avoid it, but also it's not a good way to learn. So sometimes saying, oh, I wonder if you're interested in this, perhaps that's not how all women think. So for example, let me give you an example from the prison setting. I was the only female in the room. So if they were making sort of comments about women that were huge generalizations, I didn't feel like it was my place to, or it was helpful to go on a big feminist rant. I could have done, but I didn't see that was going to achieve anything or build on the culture. At the same point, I wasn't going to let it go, because that's not helpful for them either. So I'd say, oh, that's interesting. I don't actually feel that way. Maybe there are some people that think that, but do we, and then just sort of, I think the power of questions is brilliant. It's definitely, I mean, that's a situation in which I was representing a group that was spoken of. Obviously, there's a different, it's different if somebody's maybe making a racist comment and I cannot speak for people of color or whatever, you know, Māori people, whatever, that's not my place to say, well, you know, I can't represent that. But it absolutely, I think, needs to be called out. But I think that can be done in a way, ideally, where we're saying, oh, I wonder if that is the case for everyone. It's interesting that you've, that seems to be your experience. How many people have you spoken to who are, whatever it might be, transgender, a different race, whatever, about that? And just kind of gently, not confrontationally, but gently question where that assumption's come from. Has it actually come from these people in question? And I think that kind of work is really important if you're going to do any sort of work with empathy, because what we don't want to do is take all of our presuppositions into somebody else's world and then see our world through their lens without ever questioning our own assumptions. Then another really good question here. Any tips for managing rangatahi or tamariki in workshops who might enter a trauma headspace and need to be brought out? Great question, Miranda. There aren't very many of us. This is very exciting to have 2 of us in one place. I try to, I mean, the ways I try to avoid that happening in the first place are that I don't, so I'm not a drama therapist. I can't call myself a drama therapist because I'm not a trained counselor or psychologist. So for me, a line is that I wouldn't go into people's personal experiences. They might choose to share a personal experience in response to something we do. And I'll come to what I do then. But we wouldn't say, somebody might share a personal experience. I say, great, let's act that out. Let's explore that. I would not do that because both the beauty of drama, but then the fragility of drama is that for them to enter that space again and have other people kind of play and interact with it could be obviously incredibly triggering or traumatic. So that's why I think it's really important to work in the imaginary and the hypothetical in ways that connect very much to a person and a group's lived reality, but aren't a replaying of traumatic events. So that's a really important kind of foundational line for me in my work. But equally, obviously we need to be prepared for if stuff does come up for people anyway. What I would do is try and be aware of what's going on for somebody. Generally, I might try and get I'll bring it straight down immediately. So introduce another game or something like that. That's very much a group game, involves no performance, no one being on the spot. And I might actually just ask the person quietly, is there anything you need right now? Is there anything, would you like to take some time out? Certainly not imply they have to leave because it looks like they're struggling. Because I think, attachment is super important in those spaces. So just offering, just maybe reflecting back to the person, I'm wondering if you're feeling a bit stressed, asking them how they are, asking if there's anything they need. And sometimes it's very difficult for young people and even adults, but for young people to, in that trauma headspace, to have any idea what they might need. So having a series of options is really helpful. Like, could I get you a drink of water? Would you like to just sit quietly for a moment? Do you need to go for a quick walk? Would you like to sort of just sit and draw for a bit? Or would you rather that we just did some quieter games for the rest of the session that you can join in with? So I try and offer some options. I would definitely seek to follow up afterwards and to check that they also had kind of a safe space or person to maybe debrief with as well. But I think the key is to really bring the energy down and bring the intensity down if it looks like that's happened. To acknowledge that it's totally okay for things to be triggered and for difficult things to come up, but just to create as calm and connected a space as possible. And then that just helps to bring the person to slowly be able to come out of that extremely elevated sort of lizard brain fight, flight, freeze space and just sort of sink into a sense of safety. So I hope that's helpful. I think we are nearing the end of our time together. I am looking at getting some social media stuff set up very soon, and I'm happy to share that with the group. I'm also really happy to be contacted. I do run these groups with all sorts of different people, but I'm also happy to share some of the tools that I use that I think are really helpful and accessible for all sorts of people and practitioners to use in their work. So I'm going to put my email address in the chat now, and feel free to be in touch.
Well, that was super amazing. And you have really helped me build my kete of amazing activities. Yeah, I really particularly liked the non-verbal ones and the ways that mood can change and how you talked about developing that in a group space. So ngā mihi nui kia koe, Miranda. I feel very resourced. And yep, as I said before, you've just shared with us that your details are here and that you will be kind of like going live with some online profile pages, and we'll be super happy to amplify and share those as well. A recording of this webinar will go up before the end of the year, and we'll just update that in the new year with your details. Again, thank you so much for doing one of these weird little webinar-y things. And I know that you talked a little bit about how before we were having a kōrero, you talked about how we could actually do this in real life. So fingers crossed we get to see you at Involve 2021, which is here in Te Whanganui Atara in August. So keep checking in, everybody, on the involve.org.nz website, and also stay tuned to our Aratauhi social media pages. And so to finish off, I'll just like to have a karakia, and then we can all go on with our Wednesday afternoon. Once again, thank you again, Miranda. Kia noi tatou, kia whakairia te tapu, kia wātia te ara, kia tūruki whakataha ai, kia tūruki whakataha ai, haumie huie tai kie.